In the year 1900, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche passed away. He was born in 1844, died in 1900, died at the age of 56. He died as an atheist. Ironically, his father was a pastor. Both of his grandfathers had been in the ministry. But somewhere along the way, philosophically, experientially, he lost his way in his pursuit of God. And he looked at a piano once and said, "That piano has more of a soul than I do." In the last 13 years of his life, he spent moving between total oblivion in his thinking to struggling with what he remembered in his childhood, every now and then quoting scriptures after days and days of silence. But he's the one who popularized the phrase, "God is dead." And dying in 1900, when you move across the 20th century, he became prophetic of what the 20th century would be like in ironic terms. He said, because God has died in the 19th century, two things will happen in the 20th century. The 20th century will become the bloodiest century in history, and a universal madness will break out. Why? He said, is there any up or down left? Will lanterns have to be lit in the morning hours? Are we not straying through an infinite nothing? All these metaphors that he used were phrased upon this one line when he said, do we realize what a monstrous deed we have actually committed? What we have done when we wiped away the horizon, when we killed God, have we realized what it is we've actually done? Now, he stood by that conviction. But when he said a universal madness will break out and the 20th century had become the bloodiest century in history, the fact of the matter is, in the 20th century, modern times, while we were supposed to be coming through the Industrial Revolution and all the progress of computers and so on, we killed more people in warfare in the 20th century than the previous 19 centuries put together. In that metaphorical sense, he himself spent so many of his hours away from reality. What happened? How did all this change come about? It is fascinating to me how we look at great heroes of our time. We're approaching the 50th anniversary of the death of Dr. Martin Luther King. And he, in his speech when he received the Nobel Prize for Peace, made the comment, unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. Remember that phrase, unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. If you go to a secular university today, where the queen of the disciplines of the sciences, can you tell me which science gives you the imperative of truth and love? Which of the sciences will give you the imperative of truth and love? They are imperatives that are born from different disciplines. So if unarmed truth and unconditional love is going to be the final word in reality, we better look to some other discipline other than the mere sciences. As good as they are, as profound as they are, as helpful as they are, science can tell you what happens when you mix this with that. Science cannot tell the scientist why he or she should tell the truth about what happens. That comes from a completely different area, maybe metaphysics, if not ultimately spirituality. So I want to deal with the three major changes that took place in the last century and the responses that I would like to make to it. The first major change is the popularization of the death of God and a willingness to live with its ramifications. The popularization of the death of God and the willingness to live with its ramifications. It was not at all accidental that in the 20th century, under the scourge of Nazism, how many millions and millions were exterminated. And when I visited Auschwitz for the first time many years ago in the 80s, I remember the words of Adolf Hitler placed outside the room with the gas ovens in there. He said, I wish to raise a generation of young people devoid of a conscience, imperious, relentless, and cruel. And there at Auschwitz alone, they were being obliterated at the rate of 12,000 every day. If you go into the cemeteries in the area in many parts of the world now that memorialize the numerous tens of thousands dead, and you walked into the cemetery where some of these young Nazis had given their lives, on the outside of the cemetery are these words, melancholic rigor. almost an oxymoron. There was the rigor and the animus and the imperative of destruction and decimation. Some of them were 18 and 19 years old when you look at the markers on their gravestone. They were young, vibrant, hopeful when they were conscripted to a cause where death and destruction was really in their path. I was in my 20s when I was in Vietnam. Went to volunteer, served alongside the chaplains, and it changed my life. I saw the horror of what all kinds of brutalities can do. And I remember as I got onto the plane in Nha Trang first and then in Saigon to take off, as a young 25-year-old asking myself the question, what is my calling to a world such as this? What does God want me to do in a world such as this? Ladies and gentlemen, the problem is only magnified in how desperately the world is longing for leaders right now. But with the problem that of Nietzsche's philosophy, which had created atheism, we are now willing to live with the ramifications of all that is that we see going on, and a blatant sense of disregard for any up or down, any sense of absolutes. And so when a young man walks into a school and mows down young kids or teachers, I think of the words of Anne Graham Lotz, who had the most appropriate response years ago when somebody asked her the question, where was God? She said, look, we've kicked him out of our schools. We've kicked him out of our courts of law. We've kicked him out of politics. We've kicked him out of any arena of ethical thinking. Then when something like this happens, we won't know where he is. We don't bring him anymore into the ideas of our absolutes. And so to you young men and women, I want to say to you, learning both the easy and the hard way, form the source of your absolutes, the up and the down, the right and the wrong, and flee even any semblance of evil, because even the semblance of evil can stalk you and hurt you very deeply. The reason God gave us a moral law with the two imperatives right at the beginning, to love the Lord our God with all our heart and soul and all our mind and all our strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves, is because the second follows from the first command, to love the Lord your God. He is the source of your right and wrong. He is the source of what life is all about. He is the source of telling us that deep in your innermost being, you are an inviolable individual. That you cannot be violated, the moral law. But the fact of the matter is, you cannot really come to terms with the moral law, because the moral law was given to a people after they had been rescued from Egypt. Redemption always precedes an understanding of what righteousness is all about. And then redemption and righteousness precede worship. But if we don't understand what the reality is in our time, we'll never be able to come up with suitable answers. In fact, it is in 1900 that Nietzsche died. In 1999, in an interview, Richard Dawkins made this incredible comment. He doesn't like me quoting this whenever I quote it, but here's exactly what he said in an interview. He starts off by saying, the scientific method of thought, of logical rationalism, cannot help us think through our moral beliefs to detect inconsistencies. Can help us think through our moral beliefs to detect inconsistencies. But then he goes on to say, but you cannot use science to say fundamentally what is right or wrong. You cannot use science to demonstrate it's wrong to kill or hurt people. That comes from somewhere else. So while science may help you detect inconsistencies and so on, moral reasoning has to come from somewhere else. Then he gives this example. For example, there was a well-known television chef who did a stunt recently by cooking human placenta and serving it up as a pate, fried with shallots, garlic, and lime juice and everything. Everybody said it was delicious. The father himself had 17 helpings. Now here's his statement. A scientist can point out, as I have done, that this is actually an act of cannibalism. Worse, since cloning is such a live issue at the moment, because the placenta is a true genetic clone of the baby. The father was actually eating his own baby's clone. Science cannot tell you if it's right or wrong for you to eat your baby's clone. It can tell you that's what you are doing. Then you have to decide for yourself whether you think it's right or wrong. See, what he gave with one hand, he took away with the other. He says, science can tell you what you're doing, but you have to ultimately make the decision. And my question is, who dictates your conscience in that? Where does that come from? That has to come from a transcendent, moral first cause that gives us the very reason for our being.